Αγαπητά μέλη της Εταιρείας Ελλήνων Ιστορικών της Εκπαίδευσης, κυρία Δημαρά, αγαπητοί φίλοι και φίλες, σήμερα έχουμε την ιδιαίτερη χαρά να συνεχίζομαι ένα θεσμό που ήταν ομόφωνη απόφαση του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου της εταιρείας, το Annual Lecture, την ετήσια διάλεξη αφιερωμένη στον μεγάλο ιστορικό, τον δικό μας ιστορικό, τον Αλέξη το Δημαρά, τον δημιουργό γεννήτορα της νέας ιστορίας της εκπαίδευσης. Γι' αυτό για μας είναι ιδιαίτερη τιμή και χαρά που παρευρίσκεται η κυρία Δημαρά σε αυτή την ετήσια διάλεξη αφιερωμένη στον Αλέξη το Δημαρά. Η δεύτερη αυτή ετήσια διάλεξη φιλοξενεί έναν εξαιρετικό ειδικό στο χώρο της ιστορίας της εκπαίδευσης και γι' αυτό επίσης νιώθω χαρά και τιμή που αποδέχτηκε την πρόσκλησή μας ο καθηγητής του Καθολικού Πανεπιστημίου της Λουβέν και αναπληρωτής πρίτανη, ο κύριος Marc Depeape. Οι διαλέξεις αυτές για μας του πεδίου ή αν θέλετε με τη νεότερη ορολογία της πειθαρχίας μας έχουν ιδιαίτερη σημασία, ειδικά όταν γονιμοποιούνται από συναδέλφους του εξωτερικού, διότι μας δίδουν το πλαίσιο, την αναφορά ενός παραδείγματος που το ελληνικό παράδειγμα νομίζω το έχει ιδιαίτερη ανάγκη. Σταματάω εδώ και θα δώσω το λόγο στον Γενικό Γραμματέα μας, τον καθηγητή τον κύριο Κιμουρτζή, ο οποίος θα μας δώσει ένα σύντομο προφίλ του ομιλούντος και θα μας πει ίσα-ίσα δύο-τρία πράγματα από το περιεχόμενο για να δώσουμε το λόγο στον καθηγητή, τον κύριο Ντεπέπ. Παναγιώτη.
Καλωσορίσω και εγώ τον κύριο Ντεπέπ και τη σύζυγό του στην Ελλάδα. Να ευχαριστήσουμε πάρα πολύ που είναι εδώ. Θα σας δώσω λίγα βιογραφικά του στοιχεία στα αγγλικά. So, Professor Marc Depeape is a very distinguished person in the academic society and well known for his work in the fields of history of education in general, history of educational sciences, historiography, theory and methodology of the history of education. He studied at the Catholic Universität of Louvain and he graduated as bachelor, master, doctor and special doctor in educational sciences from the same university. He worked as researcher at the same university, as lecturer, assistant professor, and now is full professor from 1996. Today is also vice chancellor at the Catholic Universität of Leuven since 2013. He served previously as head of the Department of Educational Sciences and head of the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences. Also coordinator of the Human Sciences at the campus Kortrijk. Okay. From 2010 is fellow of the International Academy of Education and from 2012 is member of the board of directors of the International Academy of Education. He is former secretary and chairman of the International Standing Conference for the History of Education and also president of the Belgian-Dutch Society for the History of Education, vice president of the International Gesellschaft für Historische und Systematische Schulbuchforschung in Germany. He is coordinator-in-chief of Pedagogica Historica, International Journal of History of Education. He is chair of Studia Pedagogica, a new series, member of several editorial boards of national journals in the history of education. He is also supervisor of of 12 finished PhD studies and 125 master degree studies, and also promoter of 1 doctorate honoris causa at the TU Leuven for Thomas S. Popkiewicz. Professor Depeape is author of hundreds of articles and several books published in 17 different languages. His research interests are: first, the history of educational and psychological sciences, especially pedagogy, experimental pedagogy, and educational psychology. Second, the history of education and teaching, and especially primary education in Belgium. Third, theory, methodology, and historiography of the history of education as a discipline. Fourth, history of colonial education, especially in relation to the former Belgian Congo. And fifth, the history of Flemish migration in the northern of France and the role of the school in this process. His selected readings were published in 2012 by Leuven University Press with the title Between Educationalization and Appropriation. Today he is here among us on the occasion of the second lecture in memory of Alexis Dimaras to present some historiographical, theoretical and methodological reflections on the history of education. More than an antidote against amnesia is the main title of his lecture, which emphasizes on the development of historical research in the case of history of education. So thank you very much for being here. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for this long introduction, which is always very flattering to hear, of course, but I am very happy to be here in Greece and very happy that I have been invited, so a lot of thanks to the chairman and the secretary who did a lot of work for the funding and for everything. Thank you very much. When I started my career as a researcher at the end of the 1970s, history of education was mainly under the influence of German tradition, in a lot of European countries still conceived as an auxiliary or approach for pedagogy. Within such a constellation, the relevance of historical research in educational sciences, at first glance, did not seem very problematic on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Although the underlying philosophy was much more rigid in Eastern Europe, philosophically and historically, acquired insights had, from this point of view, to play an essential role in formulating the future educational policy and defining the pedagogical praxis. Therefore, also in my country, it seemed almost impossible to gloss over this general pedagogical dimension when training pedagogues, teachers, educators, and educationalists. At the end of the 1970s, I myself, undoubtedly compelled by the need to position myself in the pedagogical realm, chose not to define the history of education purely as history applied to education. Instead, I thought of it as some sort of history of the problems of and in education, situated in the intermediate area between history and pedagogy, a pedagogical historiography, a term which was coined well before its time, in the sense that I subsequently started to use this concept in a somewhat different way as an alternative to the old-fashioned but also completely obsolete notion of, quote, historical pedagogy in terms of content. But nothing is what it seems. By studying the history of the educational sciences in more detail, already at the second G.S.E.H conference in Paris, I was trying to correct my position in view of the theoretical methodological discussion of the time, and I gradually came to understand to which extent the pedagogization or educationalization of the educational past had led to grotesquely discolored views and even prostitution. Such insights led me to increasingly emphasize the crucial historicity of the history of education, an undoubtedly phased process when I look at it retrospectively. Crucial elements in this frame were the confrontations abroad with ideological systems that were on the verge of crumbling, such as communism in the Soviet Union and its satellite states, as well as apartheid in South Africa, to which the history of education traditionally granted its services. I recently summarized my current opinions on this matter in a series of statements in a somewhat offensive manner, I might add, which was first and foremost designed to elicit a discussion. My first assertion started that pedagogical historiography will be historical or not, which immediately raises the issue of relevance again. There is indeed a danger that educational historians who traditionally work in pedagogical institutions, general social and cultural historians, seem to pass up on the opportunity of contributing to the history of education, except when it comes down to writing histories of universities, or considered as, so these historians of education and pedagogical institutions are considered as a necessary luxury as a result of the gradual historicization and the related marginalization of educational history. All the more so because their discourse often is diametrically opposed to what educators, teachers, educationalists, psychologists and other pedagogical opinion makers wish to hear from them. But I am not that concerned about the position of the history of education in the long term. It is my opinion that a critical understanding of history is still indispensable for catching the nature, identity and intellectual foundations of all pedagogical activities. Hereafter, I want to demonstrate this claim by looking back historically at the quest for relevant history of education. I am convinced that this enduring pursuit of relevance has led, ironically, to irrelevant educational research, including research in the history of education. In my opinion, it is only when we as historians enter the domain of the history of science that we will be able to say something meaningful based on our own competence about possible aberrations of historical education, research in education. After all, the proof of the pudding is still in the eating. More than a decade ago, Jürgen Herbst, one of the former presidents of G.S.E.H, wanted to portray the state of the art of the history of education at the end of the 20th century in North America as well as in Europe. In his final considerations, he said that historians of education have to consider anew their presence as academics in programs of professional education. Anew implies in this context that there once existed a truly relevant history of education that was indeed integrated into teacher training programs. But what kind of history of education was that? From the last quarter of the 19th century, the success of the history of education and teacher training depended in most Western countries on the theoretical relevance of educational thought of the great masters like Montaigne, Comenius, Rousseau, Pestalozzi, and so on, and probably even more on the prospect of inculcating a pedagogically correct attitude into future teachers. Gabriel Comparet, the standard bearer of the French history of pedagogy, stated in 1884 that the various pedagogical systems of the great thinkers elevated the level of moral exhortation. We cannot imagine that Herbst simply wanted to restore the moralizing of that old-fashioned French Republican history of education. Along with other leading scholars in the field, he believed that the golden era of American educational history is not to be situated in the 19th century, but in the age of cultural revisionism of the 1960s and 1970s, during which the research agenda in the United States was strongly determined by the methodologically organized historiography of Bernard Bailyn, Lawrence Kremen, and others. Indeed, we may well assume that a paradigm shift took place under the inspiration of cultural revisionism. The history of ideas was replaced by the postulate of the social history of education. A closer look at this evolution, however, reveals a number of differentiations that can serve as an antidote to a monolithic and ahistorical conceptualization of the history of education, as Saul Cohen put it. Heinz Elmar Tenort and other German researchers observed already in the mid-1970s that a new paradigm of the social history of education could boast only a relative consensus, and that was with regard to the methodological problem in a narrower sense. The general acceptance of his social historical tools and research techniques, including quantitative methods, but this did not eliminate the fundamental diversity with regard to the methodological problem in a broader sense, namely the relationship between theory and history, not only in the field of education, but also in that of the social sciences in general. As I have indicated elsewhere, there was a fairly high degree of dissension in the theoretical position of the discipline in West Germany. For the historian of education, of course, it made a big difference whether the role of his research was limited, as the godfather of empirical research, Wolfgang Prezinka, argued, to that of a pre-scientific reservoir of hypotheses, or whether it was at the heart of educational theory formation, as in the historical socialization research of, for instance, Ulrich Hermann, or as in the ideological, critical and neo-Marxist approaches in both West and East Germany. Such theoretical differences also had practical consequences in the international organization of the scientific community of historians of education. It may be true that under the impetus of presidents of I.S.H.E. like Brian Simon, Maurice de Vroede and Jürgen Herbst himself, the new social history of education was inspirational in the founding and development of the International Standing Conference, but this certainly did not hinder the flourishing of the old-fashioned and, in my view, even dilettantish aspiration within the same organization concerning the relevance of the history of education to the solution of practical problems. One of the editors of a book presenting itself as an outcome of the meetings of the International of I.S.H.E. as a field of research and a teaching subject within I.S.H.E. simply echoed the assumptions of the old-fashioned 19th century historical pedagogy. According to Kadriya Salimova, for example, history of education is the science about the regularities of theoretical and practical development. Therefore, it must take further contribution to the solution of new tasks set by our time and dictated by the demands of modernization and educational reforms oriented to the 21st century. Without wanting to be exposed to the charge of methodological imperialism, I saw it as my duty in 1992, when I was president of I.S.H.E., to warn against such a purely utilitarian treatment of the educational heritage of the past. In my judgment, the explicit striving for ideological, theoretical or practical advantage will inevitably lead to mystification of history, to hagiographic pedagogical hero worship, and a partisan and presentistic reading of history, an opinion of which I became more and more convinced after the invitation in October 1994 to participate in a Sino-Switch Pestalogy project, as well as after a mission in September 1995 to evaluate the existing research and teaching in the history of education at the universities of the province of Gauteng in South Africa. In both cases, my critical comments encountered simplistic reasoning about lessons from the past, for a large part hiding specific pedagogical and political interests in educational reform. The nationally orchestrated attempts to popularize Pestalozzi's thought in China coincided with large-scale literacy campaigns in which the integration of manual labor and formal education was central. What made Pestalozzi attractive in China is not so much his profound historical significance, but his great immediate significance, which is reflected in conclusions like people of the contemporary era can absorb the quintessence of Pestalozzi's educational thought so as to direct and promote educational reform today. At present, I quote, the kernel of activity teaching is still the basic ideas of Pestalozzi, with lifelong devotion to education and indomitable willpower, Pestalozzi will always be a shining example for education all over the world. Pestalozzi's thought on labor and technical education still has far-reaching significance for guiding educational practices nowadays, and so on, and so on, and so on. Ironically enough, analogous attempts to make good use of the heritage of educational past can be found in some conservative white circles in South Africa, where historical pedagogy is still used to legitimate traditional values, even unofficially under the flag of G.S.E.H. On the basis of the so-called pedagogica perennis, a phenomenological construct about the essences of education derived from history, one can hear the plea for a cultural-based, which is in fact an unicultural, education for the diverse ethnic and religious group in the country. For Johannes Jordan, for example, education through the ages was always culturally interrelated. Cultural, religion, vernacular and historicity were always inherently part of authentic education. Remember this, he says, when re-evaluating the integration of schools in South Africa. Cramming children from all these divergent cultural groups into the same classrooms negates the pedagogica perennis. End quote. Although the political and ideological power implications of such reasoning still have to be brought to the surface by studying the concrete social, cultural, historical context to which they relate, they nevertheless instinctively make me think back to how the Catholics fleshed out the subject of the history of education in pre-conciliar Flanders. After the First World War, the priest-educationalists De Hoover and De Koene made an attempt to underpin education from a Catholic point of view through the publication of the Flemish pedagogical journal Vlaams Pedagogisch Tijdschrift. What they were ultimately aiming for was a conservative revolution, I quote, a rebirth through rebaptization in the eternal, rejuvenating source of Catholic educational philosophy, unquote. For De Hoover, the Catholic philosophy of life was the cornerstone of all modern life theories, the prototype, the Platonic idea, the essence of all real pedagogical thinking, the pedagogia perennis, there you have it again, the foundation of real educational tradition, the mother tongue of educational wisdom, the herald of educational truth, from where all idols of false sources of modern educational theory would be judged. This combative position meant that historiography could not be neutral, nor educational theory. I quote, all the theory from the modern understanding of historical data has shown that personal sympathy constitutes as primary condition for understanding a man, a work, or an event, thereby indicating that the past had to be seen through Catholic eyes, in which the extent of admiration for the great educational heroes depended on the building blocks that they supplied to Catholic educational practices. Hence, innovators, in this case reform educationalists who wanted to start with the child, such as Alexis K, were labeled by De Koene and De Hoover as big children, who have surfaced in the century of the child in order to put their great childishness in the place of age-old values, unquote. That these assumptions in Catholic Flanders have continued to resound for a long time requires little debate. Much more remarkable is perhaps their theoretical, scientific analogy with the Marxist-Leninist principles of educational history and educational theory in the former Eastern Bloc, and more particularly in the so-called GDR, where a lot of consideration was given to the theoretical methodological foundation. There too, the dialectical unity of the logical and the theoretical and the historical formed the core of historical educational theory. Within the bounds of the Marxist-Leninist epistemology, the past appeared as the inevitable and necessary developmental process towards the socialist society. The history of human society was regarded as a succession of class conflicts. The different episodes of the class struggle were demarcated by a revolution, which in itself constituted the climax of the conflict. Once the class society had been transformed into a communist society as a result of the Great Revolution, the ordered nature of their blind determinism was disposed of. In the socialist form of society, people got to know the forces that determine society. As a result, they became masters of history, and they could apply this knowledge to the realization of a socialist message of salvation. This principle applied mutatis mutandis to Marxist-Leninist educational theory. Without a systematic exploration of the past, the progressive construction and planning of the future was impossible. Just like the past, present and future, theory and practice in Marxist-Leninism were dialectically connected and thus inseparable from one another. A number of functional consequences arose from these theoretical methodological fundamentals for education in the history of education that were not only conceived as the center of educational theory, but also as an essential component of general cultural history. First of all, the pedagogic heritage of the past had to be laid bare, as familiarity with the progressive legacy of former educationalists was very useful for historical, shall we say, socialist awareness in general, and that of teachers in particular. Moreover, the association with the socialist heritage could be placed in the struggle against